So, General Mattis, I recall late 2016 when you got the word from our president-elect that he wanted you to serve as our country's 26th Secretary of Defense. You were at Stanford. I saw you in the coffee lounge, veterans tailgates, a much-deserved break after 43 plus years of service, and your legacy was secure. What factors led you to accept this nomination? Was it a difficult decision, and why or why not?
It's a great question, folks. You see, in order to be the Secretary of Defense, there's a law that says you must have been out of uniform 7 years. So I was smiling as I was watching the news, saying, apparently you people didn't read the law. I've only been out 3 years. And I was very, very happy at Stanford. I was teaching at about a dozen colleges a year. I felt like I'd done what I was good at, been much longer in the military than I ever intended. So when I flew back, I got the phone call. I was working at my local food bank. It was Thanksgiving break, actually, when I got the call. And so I flew back to New York, actually. And I went in to see the president-elect, and there was the vice president-elect, the chief of staff, Steve Bannon, Ivanka and Jared Trump. I think that's about it, in a room. And I walked in, and I reminded them that there was a law about this. And we'll get that changed. I guess kind of, I don't think so. not nowadays. But he said, well, we don't need allies anyway. I mean, I said, oh, I'm not so sure about that. I said, you used to make those great big tall buildings in New York City called skyscrapers. I said, if you didn't have NATO, you'd build it. We need it that badly. That kind of got his attention. So he said, well, that's another one. Right? That's a specific one I don't think we need. I said, oh, yes, you need NATO. And so, job interview isn't going so good now. I've disagreed with the first two questions. So I'm saying, well, the third one's got to be a good one here. And he asked me if I could do the job. I said, I can do the job. I know some other people who could too. And so he asked who, and I immediately offered up some of my friends, knowing they'd kill me if they knew I was offering them up for the job. And then he said, well, sometimes you just have to use torture. And I said, no. That should never be a government policy. Ever. And besides, with a cup of coffee and a cigarette, you need to get everything you need out of the prisoners anyway, so don't worry about that. And why am I telling you this? Because I was raised by a generation, you and I call it the greatest generation. They grew up hungry in the Depression. Over 25% of the young boys drafted into the U.S. Army to fight in World War II had to be fattened up in order to go into training. They were malnourished from the Depression. Show you what kind of country they grew up in. These guys, this generation, had been through a war that had killed hundreds of thousands of their buddies, and they came home and said, what a crummy world, and we're part of it whether we like it or not. And so they put together this international order, but also what they taught us in their quiet way, not a lot of demonstrative patriotic feeling or anything, was that when you're asked to do something for the country, it's not only a privilege, it's a duty that you do it. So my idea was, Republican or Democrat, male or female, president asks you to do something, don't be Hamlet up on the top of the castle wall, wringing your hands. If you're prepared to do it, just say yes. So I told him, yes, I can do it. Then we walked out on the porch, and he said, I thought this will be the fastest job interview. I'm on my way back to Stanford, hooray. And he walked out and said he was going to basically hang on to me, and I was dumbfounded. So anyway, that's how it happened. Not a lot of thought went into it. Did I aspire to the job? Did I want the job? I'd been the executive secretary as a colonel. That means you sit right next to Dr. Perry, Secretary of Defense, and then Senator Cohen when they turned over. I'd woken the Secretary of Defense up enough times in the middle of the night. I'd watched them on Christmas Day being called to hurried conferences. I'd seen the sobering effect of handing someone the card that you carry in your pocket at all times that had to do with the nuclear release codes and the sobering experience. I had no interest in the job, but it was a duty to be done, so I was on my way, Joe.
Well, thank you for that great service, General Mattis. On the topic of rising to the occasion, in your book, you quote Winston Churchill, amongst many other great leaders. But this quote from Churchill, he says, "To each there comes in their lifetime a special moment when they are figuratively tapped on the shoulder and offered the chance to do a very special thing, unique to them and fitted to their talents. What a tragedy if that moment finds them unprepared or unqualified for that which could have been their finest hour." General Mattis, what advice would you give the young people here on this call to how to best prepare for their impending special moment, and how to be sure this opportunity to serve does not pass them by?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is you have got to be excited and eager to be a lifelong learner. You can never stop learning. I really came of age because by the time I was 21 years old, I was overseas as a second lieutenant in the infantry with my 40 sailors and Marines living in the mud. And I think that the the U.S. Army, I think Colonel Felter, Army is pretty much guided by von Clausewitz, a dead German guy, by the way. The Air Force is guided pretty much by a guy named Douay, dead Italian guy. The U.S. Navy is pretty much guided, like most navies, by a dead American guy named Mahan. The U.S. Marines are pretty much guided by a dead classical Chinese guy from a long time ago named Sun Tzu or Sun Tzu, to pronounce it a little better. And that, of course, there's a Confucian aspect to the Eastern thinking. And I would just suggest to you that you make certain you keep a balance of body, mind, and spirit. You stay active physically. You keep mentally agile by listening to people who disagree with you, reading things more broadly than just your chosen profession, and stay in touch with wherever you get your spiritual strength from, whatever that source is. Because you're going to get to a point where you'll realize the only thing you can really control in this world is how you respond to what happens around you. And if you have that degree of honesty when you look in the mirror and you say, I'm not a victim, even if in America they've given victimhood an exalted status, if you remind yourself that cynicism is just another form of cowardice, everything's so screwed up, I can't do anything about it, so I'm just going to find fault with everything around me. If you reject victimhood and cynicism, and by keeping yourself in balance, you're always trying to put others first, which is one of the reasons why government service, public service is so important to a person's development, keeping them human. Then you'll be ready. You'll be ready is the bottom line. You don't have to be perfect. Don't try for perfection. I left that to God a long time ago. Just do your best, but most importantly, do what is necessary. And don't give yourself any wimpy ways out because you will be audited if you go into public service. You'll be audited by auditors, you'll be audited by war, you'll be audited by elections, and just look forward to the brawl. Give it your best, and if you're ready for it because you're a lifelong learner, you'll actually a whale of a lot of fun too.
Thank you, General Mattis. General Mattis, you mentioned the greatest generation and the importance of responding in challenging times. We're in the midst of a pandemic now, which this is the first major crisis that most of the young people on the call tonight have ever experienced. Could you provide them some historical perspective on prevailing in a time of crisis? What does it take to serve, and more importantly, to lead effectively in these extreme times in crisis where, as you said so many times in our history, we could lose it all? Yeah,
ladies and gentlemen, I would just suggest to you that a leader's role in a crisis, especially then, it's always the case, but in a crisis, it's absolutely essential is do as swiftly as possible, not hastily, make sure that you define reality. Use evidence, use what you know, use your experience to make assumptions. Be honest that you don't know something, you're going to have to make an assumption. But you have to define reality. A second point is your parents paid for my 40 years of tuition to learn how to fight, frankly. And I had the privilege of fighting many times for our country. I didn't really join up to fight. I joined up because I had to. But I didn't like some of the jobs as a Marine. I learned to hate minefields at age 21, and I wasn't real happy about having to wear a gas mask at times. But I fell in love with the young sailors and Marines who'd bite their lip and crawl into minefields looking for something they didn't want to find so their buddy wouldn't get hurt. And so in all those years, as I went through these formative experiences, I don't know how to defend this country in a crisis or any other time really, but especially so in a crisis without allies. I don't know how to do it. It's arithmetic in some cases. So we're going to need allies. In all the times I was privileged to fight, I never fought in an all-American formation. I have fought alongside probably 40 other countries, Joe, when we were in Afghanistan, actually up to 49 countries. It's down to 41 right now. That's because they're there because the United States, your country, was attacked on 9/11. And that many countries, and 3 of them, by the way, have had more of their boys per capita die in combat than America has, just to show you what they've paid. So I think the most important thing is to have someone who defines reality, and that reality must include how do we get with like-minded nations. They won't all be democracies. Some we won't even like too much. I'm sure FDR did not like Joseph Stalin when he made common cause with him to defeat Hitler. But when you go into strategy in protecting this experiment, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And so what you do is you go in and you make sure you're prepared and you learn in the easier times, how do you guide people in a crisis? And there, I'm just going to tell you, there's only one word that you have to worry about, whether you're a young officer or a 4-star, and that's trust. Once a lieutenant earns the trust of his soldiers, sailors, Marines, whatever, they will win all the battles for him. Once a 4-star wins enough trust, other nations will entrust him with their soldiers. For example, I had 250-some thousand troops under my command as the commander of CENTCOM. Only a little over 200,000 were Americans. Nearly 50,000 were other nations trusting America enough to put their troops under our command. And so remember about trust in a crisis situation. With it, you can do a lot, almost anything. Without it, it's brittle and you can hardly do anything.
I got it. General Mattis, expanding a bit on the importance of allies and partners. You certainly were a strong advocate. You know, your national defense strategy that you led at the Pentagon, you know, front and center with its line of effort too, was working with allies and partners. But what would you say to, you know, there's some individuals that are a little more skeptical of the utility of working with allies and partners. So how would you communicate the benefits of international cooperation, you know, to perhaps to the average American, you know, that may be persuaded by the near-term gains, you know, and the reduced liability that a more isolationist policy might offer?
Yeah, first of all, history is adamant about this. Nations with allies thrive, nations without allies die. I can show you this repeatedly in history. There were times, Joe, when what I wanted to do was put the flags of 49 nations on 14th Street Bridge in Washington, D.C., so those tens of thousands of people pouring into town each day were reminded there's 49 nations out there fighting, because in America, our newspaper just talk mostly about our Americans who are there. It's understandable. But Winston Churchill put it well when he said, look, he said, the only thing tougher than fighting with allies is fighting without allies. In other words, it's hard. I think sometimes General Eisenhower in World War II spent more time trying to keep peace between Charles de Gaulle, Winston Churchill, and trying to keep the Polish not getting angry at the way the British were treating them in terms of weapons being assigned to them. I mean, it seemed like he spent more time doing that than fighting the Germans time. But that's the way it is. You know, that's just the way it is. For example, as commander of U.S. Central Command, now that's United States Central Command in Tampa, we had 66 nations in what we called Coalition Village. 66 nations, part of United States Central Command. Now, why do I bring it up? Because every one of those troops they brought in meant one less American troop who was there. Every dollar they spent meant one less dollar that we had to put in defense and we could put into education or healthcare. Every time a nation put their troops there, you better believe in the United Nations, they were voting right alongside us as we tried to force this issue, for example, Afghanistan, into a peaceful outcome, try to end the war. So when you look at diplomatic support, economic support, when you look at the human cost of war, there's a saying in the Marine Corps that if you're going into a gunfight, bring all your friends with guns. I've never been on a crowded battlefield. We need others there. And it's also a point that remember that when we started NATO, my fine young folks, and it took a foreigner to teach me this. I'm sitting in his backyard having lunch with an ambassador, foreign ambassador in Washington, D.C. At this time, I'm a NATO Supreme Allied Commander, 4-star general, and I'm in NATO, not assigned to a U.S. force. And he said, you know, after World War II, America made the single most self-sacrificial pledge in world history. And I think I know something about history. I said, after World War II, you mean the Marshall Plan, where we had all this money and we're giving it, 3 years after we defeated the Nazis, after what the Japanese had done to our prisoners of war. 3 years later, we were contributing to their economies. As Harry Truman put it, when asked what he was proudest of as president, he said it's that we whipped the fascists and then we welcomed the German and Japanese and Italian people back into the community of nations. Ambassador shook his head, no. He said, that shows just how generous America is. The people who want to say you don't live up to your ideals, they should look at that. But he said, no, the most self-sacrificial pledge was after World War II, when you could have looked at Europe and said, that's twice in 25 years, you drew us into one of your stupid wars. We're through with you. We're turning to Asia, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East. You're on your own with the Soviet forces that are now being built up on the inter-German border. He said, instead, you pledged 100 million dead Americans in a nuclear war to defend democracy in Europe. Took a foreigner to teach that to me. So why do I bring it up? NATO, over all those years, holds on, and the democracies stand united until finally the internal rot, the internal friction of the communist system breaks the Berlin Wall, and communism falls as a global threat from the Soviets. Remember that the first time NATO goes to war is not because we were there to protect them. It's when New York City is attacked on 9/11. That's when they go to war. Which of the greatest generation anticipated that we would need them? They signed up because they needed us. They were flattened by a war. Stay humble as you look at what's going on, because interests change, times change, and there's the proof in the pudding for all those who question whether allies are worth it or not.
Thank you, General Mattis. Shifting gears a bit to a topic that's, I think, near and dear to some of our engineers and scientists here at Stanford and Silicon Valley. America's advantage in the technology sector, it's diminishing relative to our closest competitors. And for a range of reasons, we've seen a reluctance by some of our top tech companies and startups alike to support our government's efforts to address those pressing challenges facing our defense and intelligence organizations. What can we do to help ensure we bring our best technology and keep the engineers and scientists that develop it, bring them to the table to help America keep its technological edge?
Yeah, I think you have to remind people of the value of the freedoms we have in America. Now, it's somewhat hard, it's somewhat hard to do, I think, right now, ladies and gentlemen, because I go up to Dartmouth, I spend 30 days there in residence, or 10 days at Berkeley. Sorry about that, Stanford. I do 5 days at USC. I just go around, talking to young people brought into various schools. And as I look at the history books, I'd go to the bookstore in between classes. I would have a hard time finding affection for a country if I had studied America as I read about it in some of the history books that are given to our young people in high schools and college today. I'll just tell you right up front, it doesn't sound like a very appealing country. Now, after you've wandered around the world and realized that if you compare America to its ideals, it will always fall short because our ideals were set so high. But the fact is, the world without an America, as we're finding out right now, is not such a good place. For example, if you look at 9/11, basically the entire world except for Cuba were basically lined up against Al Qaeda. I mean, even the Russian Air Force was giving us information to help, believe it or not, in those days. First country to raise a statue to those murdered on 9/11 in Bayonne, New Jersey, Russia, first country. So you see that all these countries coming together. Take the global financial crisis, 2008 to 9, even turning over from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. They worked together, the incoming and outgoing administration, the G7, the G20. They could have said, America, your mortgage crisis started this. There was no finger pointing. They all went to work and we got through it, and it could have been a lot worse. 2014, ISIS comes snarling out of the desert, creating millions of refugees, enslaving Yazidi girls, just murdering everywhere they went. And right now, 77 nations work together on this crisis. Right now, what we're seeing is if America doesn't lead, as we led in all three of those, if America doesn't lead internationally, not much happens. So one of the reasons we need you young folks to come in with this understanding is because we need to get back to leading. And how do you lead? Let's go back to the father of our country. This is a good lesson, very boring lesson. George Washington, with the help of the French advisors, Lafayette, Prussian advisors, some British advisors, Polish. How does he make an army of farmers and independent-minded Rhode Island guys? You don't want to listen to those grandees of Virginia, and meanwhile down in the Carolinas, they don't care for anybody from Delaware. Those watermen don't know what they're doing. How did he put this army together, disciplined, realizing if they didn't stay disciplined, they would be annihilated on the battlefield by the redcoats, who would humble Napoleon just a few years later? He did it very simply. He would listen to what was going on. He didn't just listen to hear them so he could reject them. He listened, willing to be persuaded. And then he would learn from them what their vital points were, what their key points were, and look for common cause. Then he would help them in some way, and then he would lead. So listen, learn, help, and then you lead. Not arrogance, not dismissive, not contemptuous, not being, I'm a general, you do what I say. Anybody who thinks command and control is the way the military runs things shows they've never been in the military. It's command and feedback. I never argued with a 19-year-old Lance Corporal who yelled at me, an officer, to hit the deck. I said, right on, son, and I'm going down, okay? You learn to listen and learn from them. Why? Because that shows respect. Then you help them because that brings you as a human and them together. Then you lead. And if we don't do that on something like COVID, then we're going to watch this run rampant, because guess what? It doesn't know where the border signs are. It doesn't care where border signs are. Anyway, I know I went a little around on that one, Joe, but I wanted to get that point out.
Outstanding, General Mattis. I think I'm going to turn it over to Srim. We've got some great questions from these bright Stanford students, but thank you, General. We look forward to the student questions.
Thank you so much, General Mattis, for that. That was incredibly fascinating. We have a lot of audience questions that people wanted to ask about. So, Antonia, if you want to kick it off, we can get started.
Certainly. So our first question comes from a few students. They'd like to know, how do you approach public service when you may disagree with your government administration or leader? In other words, how do you approach the balance between serving loyally in a hierarchical system and sharing your personal views and convictions? You offered a couple examples of doing this in your job interview for Secretary of Defense, but are there any other examples of times when this was difficult?
Yes, and certainly in the military, where we have civilian control of the military, there were times when we didn't agree with things. For example, I think it's pretty well known that on the invasion of Iraq, the U.S. military's advice was don't do it. Do not invade Iraq. It was very blunt. Some of those officers, generals, were sent home. Some of them were supposed to be promoted. They were not promoted. They were retired. And we invaded Iraq, and we did it to the best of our ability. Another example would be I was in a very tough area, a place called the Sunni Triangle. My sailors and Marines and soldiers were well outnumbered in that area. And some contractors were murdered, and it was on TV as their burned bodies were hoisted in the air. And I did not want to go. We had the pictures of who did it because they danced around the street. And it was a tribal town. We knew some members of the tribe would help us. Of some of the tribes that hated the guys who'd done it, were repulsed by what the inhumanity. So I said, let me handle it. We will find where they live. We'll hunt them down and we'll kill them. But I do not want to jump into the town. It was a town of 300,000 people, and I was outnumbered already, and I didn't have enough assault troops. I was ordered to do it anyway. I said, okay, I will do it. That's the decision, but don't stop me. And deep inside the city, I was stopped. My boys in house to house fighting, very vulnerable. I lost people because of it. And then we had to fall back, handing the enemy a victory that then we had to reverse at enormous cost and killed and wounded months later. So you have to keep faith with the system that the Constitution is right. You have to keep faith that the American people they won't get it right every time, but overall, it's the worst form of government except for all the rest we've tried. Now, you go into something like, let's take the job as Secretary of Defense, because that one's, in your experience, you're old enough to understand that one. So I go in, and first of all, he hires me after I disagreed with him on the 3 questions he asked. So obviously he's willing to listen to someone who disagrees with him. That's my going in assumption. I was honest with him. I told him where I stood. A week after our talk, he went to the New York Times editorial board and he walked back on torture. He said, no, I don't think we need that anymore. He showed he was willing to listen. Now, there came a point when I was in the job, and I intended to go for all 4 years. I don't half-step when I do something. There came a point where my advice was not being heard, and eventually, over matters of policy, matters of principle, frankly, about treatment of allies, I was no longer willing to see myself as additive to the country's defense. And so in a public statement, I gave him a letter. I went over and I talked with him privately. He knew where I stood on this. And when I saw I wasn't going to make any change to what one of his decisions was, I handed the letter over to him. People have since asked me, why don't you come out and attack him? Well, for some reason, some of the lads in the military, some of the young ladies have taken a fondness to me. And I'm not going to come out against the elected commander-in-chief. Remember, under the Constitution, whether I say something good or not, the next day, they still have to obey his orders. They don't need that right now. This country's in more danger than many people in Silicon Valley register. And so we're going to have to make certain that they know that their orders are their orders, carry them out to the best of their ability. And if you're senior enough, remember, you can only quit once. And in the military, the privates can't quit. So stick with them as long as you can and keep the faith, but maintain your ethical stance, your moral stance as well. And that's why I'm from the West, where we say, and I think in Houston, Texas, that actions speak louder than words. I made clear where I stood on it.
You mentioned supporting and defending the Constitution. Another student is wondering, how do the requirements established by the commissioning oath to do so, meaning to support and defend the Constitution, and to obey the orders of officers appointed over me, change when you move from commissioned service to serving in a civilian capacity?
Great question. So in the military, I'm in the Naval Service. The U.S. Marines are part of the Naval Service. And we say that once you've had your input, once you've said, I think this is what we ought to do, or given any input, when the decision comes down, you give it a cheery, aye, aye, sir, and you carry it out to the best of your ability. It does take some humility. I've been wrong before when I argued strenuously against doing something. Turned out my boss was right, and it was proven right. I was wrong. And so you have to look at this as consistent, is my point. It is consistent to take an oath like that. For one thing, you can't have the military telling you when they're going to go to war or when they're not going to go to war. That's a civilian decision. We don't allow the military to make that decision in our country. We don't want that there. We certainly should not be shy about giving our military factors. So I walked back in as the Secretary of Defense, and now I've got to say, I have to determine the policy. So I'm thinking, what do I do? First week I'm there, in comes a notebook this thick, and would come in every 2 weeks, and I'd seen it before as the Executive Secretary for the Secretary of Defense. It's the orders book. Not one ship deploys from San Diego. Not one Air Force plane deploys overseas from California. Not one Army Infantry Brigade deployed to Afghanistan without a civilian Secretary of Defense signing it. That's civilian control of the military in pragmatic terms. And this book comes in, and I'm looking at it now, and I'm trying to say, what is the criteria that causes me to shift now to answer the question? And I hand wrote this question on a card, and I scotch taped it to my stand-up desk because I didn't even want it typed. I wanted to remind myself I wrote this down. And it said, will this deployment facilitate, or what was it? Will this deployment provide for the well-being of the American people? And is it so important as to justify the death of these troops? Not that they were going in harm's way, not that it was going to be in peril, not they might be injured or killed, the death of these troops. And I scotch taped it right there. Then as I went through that book, I initialed off saying yes, yes, yes. And then all of a sudden I'd see one, I put down Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, please see me. And they'd come in, and then they'd have to argue. And sometimes they withdrew it under my questioning. Sometimes I agreed, yep, you're right, I didn't understand that. There's a sheet, there's the information sheet on each one. In other words, now I was questioning the mission itself, not how to do it. That was the biggest change.
Our next question is coming from Mac, and he's wondering, what do you see as the most prominent threat that the U.S. faces now and in the future, related to defense or not? And what do you recommend for young Americans interested in public service or defense to do to prepare and combat it when the time comes?
Yeah. Let me break it in two pieces there, Mac. First of all, in terms of urgency of a national defense, let's think mostly military there, not security, not broader things like diplomacy and things like that, but just defense. In terms of urgency, North Korea. I can't tell you the number of times in my first 6 months, fortunately, we were able to push this down more into a diplomatic realm. But the outgoing administration, Obama administration, has been very helpful, very open with us about the danger. I was well briefed when I went up even for my nomination hearing. And they said, in terms of urgency, it's North Korea. Number of times in my first 6 months, I'm sitting in a room in my home, on an airplane, in a bunker inside a mountain in Colorado, in the basement of the Pentagon, as we're watching the missiles arc up over Japan. And everybody's checking in from Alaska, from California, the ships at sea, the missile tracking station in this country and that country, the submarines checking in, everybody's ready. And then we watch the arc and we know it's not going. So in terms of urgency, North Korea. In terms of power right now, Putin and Russia. Russia is Putin for all intents and purposes. He's pretty much annihilated any opposition. So we have to deal with him. He's changed 2 borders by force of arms. The only 2 borders in Europe changed by force of arms since World War II, Georgia and Ukraine. We have got to take him at his word when he talks about that Russia is the only nation that could turn America into radioactive dust. So we have to deal with that reality. And we do so by and large through NATO, I might add. In terms of will, it's PRC, it's the Chinese Communist Party. And we're just going to have to deal with that. And you see that unfolding almost daily right now. But, you know, as I looked at it, you know, coming out of the Secretary of Defense job, I went to, I stay in touch with a lot of Gold Star parents, or I go to pay my respects. I've signed hundreds of letters to parents that their lads are not coming home, their dog's not coming home. And sometimes they write back, they have questions and on, and I go around, I pay my respects, I travel around and see them. And as I listen to Americans in small towns and in city cafes around me that no one generally knew who I was wearing a suit, I got more and more worried that the biggest threat to this country is the lack of respect with each other, for each other, the lack of a willingness to compromise, to give some kind of acknowledgement that the person you disagree with, she might actually be right twice a day, just like a broken clock, you know, is right twice a day. This arrogance, this loss of the fundamental friendliness, it really, really worries me. I can imagine our adversaries cheering as we declare war on each other. Remember all those compromises our founding fathers had to make just to put the country together. And it's as if now we don't do it. The other thing is, I believe that the debt we are increasingly building on is intergenerational theft. It's people with my color hair stealing money from you. And I'm disgusted by it. If we want these government services, we're going to have to pay for it, or we're going to have to cut some of the services and live within the means, but we should not be doing this. So the debt and the loss of respect and willingness to hear each other out, to me, are even bigger threats than Russia, China, and North Korea combined.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. So the next one is coming from Perry, and it asks, at Stanford, we're often told that engaging in public service means running for elected office, working in a government agency, community organizing, etc. However, at Stanford, I've rarely heard people suggest military service as a form of public service. What would you say is the case for a Stanford graduate to enter into military service rather than these other forms of public service?
Yeah, and first, Antonio, I did not say what I would do if I was in your shoes, if I was looking at public service. The other part of Mac's question, study history, read it and put yourself in their shoes and understand why the ascent of civilization depends on people knowing what happened before. If you don't know your history, you can't light the dark path ahead. If you don't know your history, it's like you went to the florist and bought some cut flowers, then you went out in your backyard and tried to plant them. If you don't have any roots, they're not going to grow, folks. That's all there is to it. Now, why do we rarely hear about military service? Some schools are not like that. And I'm at Stanford. I remember having a discussion with a faculty member who, when I asked, why don't we have ROTC? Don't we want people who are groomed through what they learn at Stanford to be inside the military, carrying that tremendous education into the military? And he said, well, you know, I mean, we give them zip cars so they can go over to Berkeley, you know? And I said, so you'd be okay if our graduate school of business students took zip cars over to Berkeley to learn business, right? Well, that's different. Oh, is it? What it is, ladies and gentlemen, it's bias, it's prejudice. It grows out of a very divisive war, the Vietnam experience, although Berkeley had its own ROTC building burned down, and they immediately put the ROTC into another building and said it's not leaving. Because the last thing we want to do is have our fighting done by people who don't go to our school and have people making policy who never served in the military. Because when you get to that point, that gap can be very injurious, very injurious. Now, let me be blunt. If I walked into a White House meeting with a bunch of men and women in national security, and I was a 4-star, and the guy, male, that I was talking to immediately looked at my chest where we wear kind of the ribbons that show where we've been, that sort of thing. And if he had never served in the military, I knew I had a problem. Because he and I both went through college at the same time. I was not some zealot running down to join the Marines. I'll guarantee you, I just wasn't the smartest draft dodger. I joined the Marine infantry to get out of the Army. We all had to go. That's all there was to it. He knew that I knew that he knew that I knew why he didn't serve, okay? It was not a problem with women because they were not subject to the draft. So women in national security was not a problem. But we are formed by these experiences, and there is no, I would say there is no sensible reason that there is not an ROTC at Stanford. I want Stanford's kind of influence permeating our ranks. And this overweening sensitivity that it's almost like you go to school in some places, and I go all over the country teaching. I mean, I've been to almost 36 colleges since I got out of the Marines, that little interruption, 2 years of SecDef teaching. It's almost as if you go to a medical school and they say, well, you know, we don't study cancer here. It's really, really bad stuff. So we're not going to study cancer. I mean, you look at them and say, are you nuts? You got to study cancer. It's bad. You got to study it so you know how to prevent it, know how to cure it. Well, I'll just leave it there, Antonia. Go ahead. You got time for another one, Antonia?
We do have one more. So this one's from William, and he asks, many of us have seen the damage that the current pandemic has done to our country and want to help contribute to addressing the crisis. How can we best pursue public service during this challenging time and give back to our country?
Yeah, great question, William. One point I would make is remember that throughout your life, put others first, put your family first, put your community first, put your school first, put your children's education first. You know, I'm on the food board here, you know, for the people who've going through a rough patch, you know, they need help. And Americans are the most generous people in the world. Our corporations do things that no European, sophisticated Europe, I was amazed as a Supreme Allied Commander. You can't go to their Boeing counterpart or their General Electric counterpart and say, would you contribute to our ballet or our museum or our library? They say, no, that's what we pay taxes for. So from our highest corporations to the youngest, it's just amazing to see what the Boy Scouts, the Eagle Scouts do for their projects, for example. But in the midst of this crisis, many of the people who do most of the volunteer work are retired people for obvious reasons. They're still alive, they're happy to do it. They're not going through cramming for finals like you young folks are. They're not trying to raise a family and just coming out of the starting blocks, and they're newly married. So my food bank has got almost all people who are in their 70s or 80s. Now I come from an area with a lot of physicists, a lot of chemists, farmers, ranchers, nuclear engineers, that sort of thing. So you ought to see how weird the food bank board is, you know, with guys in overalls and people with, you know, things on their elbows and everything. Well, guess what? With this, we can't have all of our volunteers down in those places, open them up and making certain these families are getting the food they need. But guess what? The word got to our high schools, and now we've got, you know, 17-year-old boys and girls down there who are doing this for people. They're much more resistant to COVID, and they're helping us. As one girl put it to me, she said, hey, I'm not going to school. I got to do something. I'm going to go crazy. You know, so look for ways to put others first, and your own problems will be so insignificant when you do it. You'll think, my God, I'm fortunate. And I got time for one more if you want to do one more, Antonia.
I can ask one more. This one's from Jose, and he's wondering, Since you've been known as an avid reader with a personal collection of over 7,000 books, you've said that reading is how you remain teachable. What are some of the most important lessons you've learned through reading, and what have you learned from your most recent reads?
Yeah, most recent, what have I learned? I was reading a couple of different things about our society today, and I realized that when I was young, I wanted perfection. I expected it, almost demanded it. One thing wrong, and suddenly that loomed large as I evaluated a school, a team, my commanding officer in the military. And then as I grew older, I realized that perfection is a nice goal. There's nothing wrong with a goal like perfection, but you had to live in a much less than perfect world because the world was not going to comport itself the way I wanted it to be. Now, I did do a lot of reading. I was beholden to my parents for that, but also the Marine Corps has a required reading list. Everybody who joins the Marine Corps, every private, every second lieutenant, here's 5 books and everyone's got to read them. And then when you make corporal, non-commissioned officer, you make captain, here's a new set of books. And it keeps right on going. When you make general, they say, congratulations, son, you'll never eat poorly again. And by the way, here's your new list of 20 books, some of them written by Kissinger with 37-word sentences in them. Go study them. But the idea was that we could train people for what we knew they had to do. They had to know how to put a bandage on someone because we're in a violent prone environment. Someone's going to get hurt. They had to know how to shoot their rifle or fly their jet. But we had to educate them for what we didn't know was going to happen. And so what have I learned? Let me explain something. 9/11 hits, and I'm a 1-star, and I'm over in the Middle East a few weeks later. And one night, late at night, the fleet commander called me in, 3-star admiral. He'd done his homework. And just watch as this develops. 2 of us, we've never served together before. We know each other by reputation because in the military, your reputation is all that really matters. And he says, look, the enemy's going to fall back from Mazar-i-Sharif. The CIA and the Green Berets are up there. They're fighting well with the Afghans. They can't hold. They're going to fall back on Kabul, and Kabul has never been held in 500 years. Hear that? The admiral done his homework. He'd studied this. They'll fall back on Kandahar, their spiritual home, and sure enough, one of our bombs is going to hit the wrong place, a hospital, a school. We're going to have a lot of limits on us. Can you get the Marines from the Mediterranean, the Pacific fleets together, go into Afghanistan, land and move against Kandahar so the enemy cannot dig in for the winter? I say, yeah, I can do that. He said, okay, here's an airplane, go look at it and then tell me what I got to do. I said, okay. So I'm circling over Afghanistan one night, and as clearly as I can see you on the screen there, Saram, Gabby, Mac, and all the rest of you, Fatima, I'm looking down out of this beautiful little airplane with great cameras on it because it's a submarine airplane, looks for submarines. And I can see the fighting all over there. But based on all that reading I've done, I can see their generals were dumber than a bucket of rocks, and they'd left the back door open. And I didn't care how brave they were, the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. I didn't care how many tanks or guns they had. Didn't mean anything. They were screwed, okay? That was because I'd studied all this, and I could see exactly where they'd made their mistake. And it was as clear to me as I'm looking at you on the screen. So will history give you all the answers? No. Will reading give you all the answers? No. But it will often give you the questions you should ask as you go forward. And if you have humility, personal humility, then the doors open wide as you realize there's all this out there to be learned. Now, look, I've taken all the time I should be taking. I know you guys, young folks, have a lot of things to do to have hopefully some fun. And we're going to get through this COVID thing. And you're going to have wonderful, wonderful, bright futures because you're going to make them bright. It's that simple. But at the same time, thanks for having me on tonight. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And I wish you all well. Godspeed to you. And back over to you, Antonia and Shriram, for anything, Colonel Felter, anything you need to say to close this out.
I think that's a great note to end on, General Mattis. Thank you so much, for your time, your wisdom, and definitely your service. I can speak on behalf of all of SIG that, we really appreciate the service that you've given to this country, and it really means a lot to us. And also
Remember-
thanks.
Yeah, you just remember all of it. You're worth it. Okay. Every one of you, I don't know you, but I know you. Every one of you is worth every bit of it. I never felt like I was a martyr or I wasn't. I remain humbled. I got to fight for you. So all the best to you, Strom. I'll check off now.
Okay, thank you, General Mattis. And also thank you to our amazing moderator, Dr. Felter. Again, thank you for your time. And also, of course, Dr. Felter, for your service. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. It's a privilege to be here.
Okay, take care, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy. We really appreciate you coming out here today. Take care, everyone.